My favorite thing about Shipt since I signed up for Target Circle 360? No price markups when I order same-day delivery from tons of local stores. Only a handful of alcohol retailers and items don't count. I won't lie, I've had too much fun being like, markups on groceries? Not in my fridge. Markups on pet food? Not for my DOG. Markups on tools, electronics, home goods, meds? Not in my house. Anyway, it's awesome. Order now at shipt.com/360. Terms apply.
This is Let the Record Show, using common sense. Now, here are your hosts, Judge Richard Weinberg and Chairman Jesse Garcia.
Welcome back to Let the Record Show. I'm Judge Richard Weinberg. Jesse Garcia and Eric Levine are both traveling today, but I am indeed honored and privileged to have one of my colleagues here at WABC and WLAR with me in the studio, James Flippin, a noted reporter and opinion commentator for WABC. James, how wonderful to have you in the studio on Let the Record Show today.
Judge, it's great. You know, I've obviously been kind of watching alongside Let the Record Show and listening to you for such a long time now at 5 p.m. with Katz and Cosby that it's great to join the conversation, so to speak.
Well, there's a lot to talk about, so let's get right to it. I had an email from one of my friends, and who's been a political person a long time and a public policy leader and a one-person think tank. And he writes to me yesterday, and he's talking about how awful Trump is and how Trump has to be stopped, and if Trump becomes president again, it's very bad for the country. So I want to read to you and get your comments on my response to him, which fundamentally was just an immediate response. I just texted away and went back to him.
So you kind of just spoke from the heart when you shared this.
Yeah, and when I talk on this show or on Katz and Cosby, or when I sit in as a guest on the other shows in WABC, I always try to give the most honest, moral and intellectual commentary and opinions that I can. I don't have any hidden agendas. I'm just trying to do what I believe is the right thing for the country. So in response, and he always says, how can you support Trump? Of course, me of being characterized all the time as a common sense centrist Democrat. So I said to him as follows, and I want to get your thoughts. I said, my position has not changed. The radical left progressives have taken over the Democratic Party. They represent everything that will destroy America. Open borders, hostility to free enterprise, lawlessness, contempt for our Constitution and America itself, abandonment of national security and energy independence, abandonment of our allies, hostility to Israel, indulgence of anti-Semitism, climate obsessionism, reckless government spending, runaway inflation, to name a few. I then went on to say, and led by a party that promotes and fosters two raging mediocrities, Harris and Wallace, for leadership in a most dangerous world. And then I went on to say, and which gaslights, that is, deliberately misleads the American people about their enormous failures and erases history in the most Orwellian endeavor since Stalin. And I'm talking about the Biden-Harris administration, how they're trying to erase what they've done and what they've done wrong and their failures. And I conclude my text back to my friend by saying, so my beloved friend, Trump is the only choice in a binary choice election. So, James, what do you think?
Well, you know, Judge, I was texting with my brother this morning, and he, like us, I guess, is a supporter of Trump. And he was kind of sharing his opinion as to why it looks like Democrats and their allies in the media have kind of pivoted away from the Trump is a fascist argument to become more centered on Trump is weird. J.D. Vance is weird. There's all this talk of weird, trying to make things out to be abnormal. And I think your point is really well founded and really well based in that line of thinking. In other words, you talk about gaslighting and the need for Democrats to sort of trick people into what is or isn't really going on here. When you talk about being a centrist Democrat, enforcing laws, believing that violent crime should be punished, looking for energy independence, worrying about government spending, thinking about things like why is the far left embracing anti-Semitism and stuff like that. That sounds like somebody who could have been a Democrat 20, 30 years ago. I think
in fact, I was, and even before then.
That's what I mean. Like, I think back to like my grandmother, for example, who was a dyed-in-the-wool Democrat. She was pro-business. She, of course, backed police, felt that enforcing laws were important. But something about the way the modern left has kind of overgrown itself, right? There's this belief that all the progress and all the change that happened in the 60s didn't almost happen. There's a cottage industry that is based on hating this country and saying nothing but evil and greed and all that kind of stuff is what advanced the American brand. Now, I know you well enough to know that's not how you see things, but there's a belief amongst those in academia, intelligentsia. It's kind of this cottage industry that makes a lot of hay and content and money off of being a America hater. And I guess what's sad to a lot of people, probably yourself included, is the way in which that very leftist, frankly, Marxist mindset has kind of risen to prominence within the Democratic Party.
Well, it's a real problem because, as we often say on this show and in Katz and Cosby, we're living in the most dangerous world since the 1930s. And you have two people being promoted by the Democratic Party. By the way, not a vote for either one of them in the primary. No support. They unceremoniously pushed Biden off the stage, even though he had 14 million votes, James. They didn't have a so-called mini primary. They did not have an open convention. The convention is going to be starting next week, but they're just ratifying what they had in their virtual roll call. And so you have Vice President Harris and Governor Walz. Now, who are these people? Harris is a product of identity politics. Every position she's ever had, all the way up, is because she's a woman of color. Walz is someone who, when in Congress, and I've talked to Congressman Peter King about this, who knew him, he was kind of a backbencher, didn't have much to say, never did very much, was perceived as being a nice guy, Midwestern, folksy kind of guy, which was one of the reasons they promoted him for vice president over Governor Shapiro of Pennsylvania. It's almost like you're watching Leave It to Beaver or My Father Knows Best. He fits that profile. He could be Mr. Rogers if he's wearing a sweater. But the point is, who's the real weirdo? Now, our friend, Miranda Devine, the great columnist from the New York Post, had a great column, and she said, the wacko duplicity of weirdo Walz. Now, what? And she goes on and on and on. And so let me point out some of the salient things that she said. She said, who's the wacko, who's weird when you let your own city burn down at the expense of law and order, public safety, $500 million in destruction of property, people injured and some people died? Who's weird there, Governor Walz?
Yeah.
Who's weird when they say that the cause of the BLM rioters and Antifa rioters, well, you understand that and you have to sympathize and empathize with them? Who's weird when you have a presidential candidate like Harris, who raised money to get these looters, these rioters, these arsonists out on bail? Who's weird? Who's weird when you want to defund the police and replace them with social workers? That's great. So you have an armed robbery going on, phone your local social worker. I mean, who's weird when you sign legislation that allows young kids who don't have their head straight yet and haven't grown up to suffer the physical destruction and abuse of transgender surgery and not tell the parents about that? Deny the parents the right to do that. Who's weird when Walz closed down the whole state of Minnesota? You couldn't go to school. You couldn't go to church. You couldn't do anything. People lost their jobs, their livelihood. Who's weird when one of the most highly taxed states in the country, businesses are fleeing, and hundreds of thousands of people are fleeing? Who's weird that when you say you're a patriot and you'll fight to defend this country, when you lie about your military record and you get out when the going gets tough in your National Guard unit and to avoid being sent to Iraq, and your number two has to go to Iraq and spend 2 years? Your thoughts?
Well, yeah. I mean, I definitely agree with what Miranda Devine is saying there in that column, in the sense that you pay too much attention to what the news says and the mainstream media. They're talking a lot about Kamala has all the momentum, right? She's soaring right now. She's really doing well, all this kind of stuff. But if you pay attention to the stuff that's not being written, in other words, you read between the lines, what's some of the stuff we've seen from Vice President Harris and her team over recent weeks? Well, you talk about Tim Walz and just the selection of Governor Walz out of Minnesota. Well, what's that all about? You have to go back to the early 70s, the last time that a Republican carried Minnesota in a presidential election. It was Nixon. So why would you pick a guy as a running mate from a solidly blue state? Well, maybe it's not such solidly a blue state. In other words, there's still a lot of anger. There's still a lot of upset. There's still a lot of resentment over what happened during the summer of 2020. Now, the media wants to pretend like none of that happened, right? They'd much rather focus on January 6th, 2021, and this whole discussion of domestic terrorists from the right wing that are the big threat and all this kind of thing. But people have long memories when it comes to things like businesses being destroyed, fires being set, violent intimidation, marauding riots, after dark, destruction on television. People don't memory hold that as easily as the media does. Furthermore, I saw a report out of Axios where they were talking about there's polling that shows that 80% of the American public, 80%, feel as though the country's headed in a bad direction. So what's Vice President Harris supposed to do in that situation? All she can do is try to make herself out to be different than what has been, despite the fact that she's the vice president, despite the fact that she's inextricably linked.
Doesn't she have this line that don't let what has been create any problems?
Unburdened by what has been, hopeful for what's to come, something along those lines. And you're absolutely right. According to that report in Axios, her whole thing is win the future. She feels as though Biden's been too looking back, too regressive in his defense of democracy.
Well, it's very troubling to me when you realize where Walz and Harris stand. They are far more left than Joe Biden, who, by the way, was a captive of Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. You know, they posited him 4 years ago as his moderate, Uncle Joe, down home, earthy kind of blue-collar guy. Notwithstanding, he has mansions, and he and his family have grifted millions and millions of dollars, and which was covered up and covered up and covered up by federal prosecutors, U.S. attorneys, when that should have been exposed for what it was. But you take a look at the border, James. The border is let in millions of people. We don't know who they are. The fentanyl crisis is exploding. The cartels are here. They're flying planes. They're flying planes and drones all around, right on the Mexican border. The cartels are fighting each other, but it's right on the Mexican border next to our states, whether it's Arizona or New Mexico or California. So you have three of our states that are exposed because of the fights of the cartels. The adrenaline rush that these people get by saying, oh, she's new, she's improved, she's wonderful. It's the politics of joy. It reminds me of the old song that they played for Roosevelt in 1932. Happy days are here again. And they try to posit Trump as being dour and sour and down. Well, happy days are here again only if we can restore the vitality, the energy, and the strength and respect for America. Happy days will not be here again when we are crime-ridden, our border is open, our economy is in shambles, we have no national security, our enemies do not respect us at all, they do not fear us, Our allies cannot depend on this. Happy days are here again with Kamala Harris and Walz. Walz, who signs bills saying when these illegals come into our country and they have no right to be here, they should not be prosecuted criminally, and Harris believes that as well. They should be given driver's licenses and jobs and welfare benefits. And they want to give, Harris and Walz want to give Social Security and Medicare to these people. Those are happy days here again. I say those are the worst possible days to come forward. This is Let the Record Show. I'm Judge Richard Weinberg, and with me, I'm honored and privileged to say, is the noted reporter and opinion commentator at WABC, James Flippin. We'll be back in a moment with more interesting conversations. Stay tuned.
Let the Record Show is on the air.
This episode is brought to you by LinkedIn. Psst, healthcare pros, word's out, and it's too good to keep quiet. Look, LinkedIn is revolutionizing job hunting, making it possible to search by specialty, shift preference, and salary. Endless scrolling is out. Whether it's a mental health therapist or dental hygienist, finding the perfect role is faster and easier than ever. Head to linkedin.com/healthcare and start your search today.
The rural way of life is about making everyone feel at home. Tractor Supply chose advanced 5G solutions from T-Mobile for Business to transform intelligent customer service. Together, we put the power of AI to work across 2,200 stores, keeping things running seamlessly inside, curbside, and countryside. This is elevated customer experience. This is Tractor Supply with T-Mobile for Business. Take your business further at T-Mobile.com/now.
Home means something different to everyone. But with Rocket Mortgage, home can mean even more. It can mean a college education, taming your high-interest debt, even a renovation. We've made it easier than ever to use your home equity. That home you worked so hard for, now it can work hard for you. Call 800-4ROCKET or visit rocket.com to find out more.
Rocket Mortgage, LLC, licensed in all 50 states, and MLSConsumerAccess.org, number 3030.
5 immersive worlds, 1 amazing theme park. Get ready to explore the all-new Universal Epic Universe, featuring the wizarding world of Harry Potter, Ministry of Magic, Super Nintendo World, How to Train Your Dragon, Isle of Berk, and Dark Universe. Epic Universe, now open at Universal Orlando Resort. Our universe will never be the same. Tickets and packages on sale now at universalorlando.com.
This is Let the Record Show. Now, here are your hosts, Judge Richard Weinberg and Suffolk County Republican Committee Chairman Jesse Garcia.
We are back on Let the Record Show. I'm Judge Richard Weinberg. Jesse Garcia and Eric Levine are traveling today, but I'm fortunate indeed to have in the studio with me is my good friend, esteemed colleague, noted reporter, and opinion commentator James Flippin of WABC and WLIR. So, James, at the break, you wanted to share some more thoughts with our listeners.
Yeah, I just think that it's very interesting, the comments you make about this happy days are here again, this push for joy, the prevailing talking point amongst a lot of people in mainstream media over the last week. And all you have to do is Google the word Kamala and the word joy, and you'll see all these different news outlets that are kind of putting that message out there.
All on the same message.
All on the same message, that they're selling joy, that it's a anti-Trump message to be pushing joy. And I just think that concept of joy, happiness or whatever, is very cheap and meaningless and vacuous and plastic, whatever word you want to use, because
it's vibes. Isn't that the word they're using?
There you go.
The vibes are good.
The vibes are good.
God, welcome back to the 60s.
Right.
Pass a joint and have some good vibes.
100%. But at the same time, and connecting back to maybe some of those same cultural issues, if you will, what is it that's really at the forefront of the Democrats' messaging right now? Well, we know the most prevailing thing is hate Trump. Hate Trump. Consider him bad. Every single thing he's ever done, any breath he's ever taken, it's evil. So that's not really joyous. Secondly, one of their biggest things is abortion, right? They've made a big focus on abortion. They say, oh, Trump got rid of Roe v. Wade. That's going to put women at risk. They need the ability to do X, Y, and Z when it comes to abortion. Again, abortion, certainly a political issue. Nothing about it is joyful. And then you think about the other aspect of the Kamala Harris camp, you alluded to it. It's a lot of identity politics. It's focusing on the fact she's a woman. It's focusing on the fact that she's of Indian and Jamaican descent, I should say. It's nothing about some sort of big policy or some push for what's going to make people healthier, wealthier, more content, whatever it may be. It's all this other stuff that they're somehow trying to convince us is really joyful.
Well, I'm not joyful because I know about her record. I'm not joyful when I know that during the Biden-Harris administration, inflation was rampant and it's still bad. And now it's gone down a little bit, so they're pounding their chest. Say, look at us, it's going down. But it's still substantially up by points and points and points and points and points and points and points during the closing days of the Trump administration. It's not a good record that they abandoned Afghanistan and gave the biggest military base to control of the Taliban, who allied with China. That's not happiness. That's not joy. That's not a record to run on. It's not joyful that they put pressure on the state of Israel, our most reliable ally in the Middle East and perhaps the world, and constantly force the Israelis to make concessions when the Israelis are the victims of a war of aggression against them, killing 1,200 people and kidnapping as hostages some, 250, maybe half of which they claim is still alive, but who knows? They fight this war because you're dealing with a death cult, which is both political and ideological and religious, which is sworn to the destruction of the state of Israel. They do not want a two-state solution. They do not want coexistence. When Sharon, who was a great general, a warrior, said, I'm going to give Gaza to the Palestinian people, he gave them all the industrial capacity was built, all the gardening and food supply capacity was there, all the water supply that was there, everything they needed, communication supply. So what do? They came in with their bulldozers, these enlightened people from the 8th century, and bulldozed everything. And the metal they took and they made armaments out of it. They built tunnels, and they built military equipment and supplies. They set up an underground world down there, which was their desire to be impenetrable against a counterattack by the Israelis. And they launched attacks and attacks and attacks, and they kidnapped people and murdered people and sent out rockets against Israel. They kill their own people. How? Because they use them as cannon fodder, because they want to build up the record of deaths and saying, look what the Israelis are doing. They forget that, in fact, they're using their own people as human shields. Next, how can you believe the health department of the Hamas government? Because we know they lie. They lied as, these are just hospitals. They found out when they went in that these were armed camps peopled by Hamas military. They, when they took over Gaza from the Palestinian Authority, their political opponents, they took all their enemies and they threw them off the top of roofs. They don't have elections. And, people say, well, the innocent people are being subjugated. Well, maybe they are. But when they do polling, 70, 80% of the people in Gaza, and also people on the West Bank, they support a war against Israel. When they say, James, from the river to the sea, they mean the destruction, the extermination of the Jewish people there. They mean the destruction of the state of Israel as a separate entity. The only government they want, the only state they want, is an Islamic fundamentalist state that they control. Mm-hmm. And who's behind all of this? Iran. Your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I mean, look, when you look at the difficulty of the ongoing Israeli-Palestinian conflict, of course, the Hamas game plan is more or less unstoppable from a terrorism perspective. If you're going to be considering what terrorism is, right, the targeting of civilian populations and the infiltrating of civilian populations when it comes to things that are largely political or policy based, like things like borders and the establishment of countries and stuff like that. If you're going to be a terrorist organization that roots yourself into civilian populations, if, like you said, has a office or a center in the middle of a hospital, in the middle of an apartment complex, what is anyone supposed to do?
And schools. They launch rockets from schools.
In other words, how could you possibly target that group without potentially incurring civilian casualties? But at the same time, the opposite side of that coin would be that you're unable to strike those military terrorist targets. So it's a really, really sticky and difficult situation. I think everybody accepts that. But what a lot of people say, and something that I've latched onto, is, sadly, and perhaps the most tragic aspect of it, and you make the good point that there's people in Gaza, polling would suggest that a lot of them still support Hamas and so on and so forth. But in essence, if you don't take out Hamas, if you don't hit Hamas, if you don't have a strike against them, you're more or less telling the rest of the world, this is what you do when it comes to terrorism. This is how you beat the system. You put yourself in civilian centers. You surround yourselves with hostages. You take hostages and keep them and try to negotiate back and forth. It's part of the reason why the famous line 20 years ago was, we don't negotiate with terrorists.
And which made perfect common sense. Look, I'm not a hero with other people's lives. I'm not an armchair general. I'm not a proponent of war. I'm not part of the so-called military-industrial complex who makes money on this deal. But what I do know, when there's an attack against Western civilization, and this is the first step, and let's be clear about this, when the chanters in Iran say, death to Israel, death to America, you should believe what they're telling you. They're dedicated to the proposition that we are the great Satan, Israel is the little Satan. There's one step removed from coming after us. They've flooded Europe with illegal migrants, and then the dopey Europeans have legalized them. And now you have sectors of all the great cities of Europe where you have these encampments, these no-go zones, controlled by people who want Sharia law. They've established their own little world in somebody else's country. If you want to come to America, you should believe in American values, support the Constitution of the United States, and defend America. You're not here to make an encampment to destroy the United States of America. You're not going to Belgium, France, England, Italy, or Spain to be the creator of a whole new world, an Islamic fundamentalist worldwide jihad against European civilization and Europe itself. We have to wake up to this, because this is a fight that has to be fought and has to be won. And it's not won by being nice.
There's so many thoughts that are kind of coming together as you're sharing things. And I find it really fascinating to be able to talk to somebody who, again, is more of the traditional Democrat mindset when it comes to some of these things. Like, for example, the Israeli-Palestine conflict, it can be difficult to put a finger on it sometimes, because you made the really good point, at least in my view. October 7th was an attack on the Western world. And yet, if you think about it from the left's perspective, they like to refer to Israel as a group of colonizers, almost like this idea of imperialism on display. They're obviously going to reject that view of the so-called West. You think about some of the more hardliners on the right and the America First movement, they largely object to the spending on foreign things like Israel and the influence of the AIPAC lobby and so on and so forth. But I think your point is so well founded. In spite of all those geopolitical, we don't like colonial, we don't like, neoconservatism and globalism and stuff like that. We're pushing against all that. But you make the really good point. What about the Western world? What about what's going on in the UK right now? What about what is going on even in our country with the infiltration of migrants and so on and so forth? You do have to stop and say, even if you reject the idea of, the neoconservative, more globalist mindset, you still have to hold on to those Western principles, those Western ideals of liberty and expression and protecting people from violent instances and pushing back and fighting and not tolerating terrorism as a tactic and all that kind of stuff. it's amazing how that part of the debate has kind of been eliminated because it's almost like it's out of sight, out of mind. And that connects to some of the stuff I was thinking about at the start of the segment, where you talked about how economics, foreign policy, so much of that is paramount in the November election. But it's also the kind of stuff that people sort of struggle to understand sometimes. Foreign policy, economics. Can't quite put your finger on it sometimes.
Well, you made a very good point earlier. The Democrats want to talk about abortion. And it's a complicated question. Now, in my mind, two thoughts on Roe versus Wade. Number one, when, as a matter of constitutional law, when they created, coming out of a so-called right of privacy, which does not exist in the United States Constitution, when they created Roe versus Wade, it was overreached by the Supreme Court of the United States. They nationalized, they federalized an issue that fundamentally is a state issue. So I think it was wrongly decided, in my opinion as a lawyer.
And there's a lot of legal minds that would agree with you on that. I'm in good company because some of the best legal minds agree with me on that issue, whether it's Jonathan Turley or Alan Dershowitz or Greg Jarrett or John Yoo. I think even Ruth Bader Ginsburg once upon a time argued that it was bad law.
Exactly right. And it was bad law. Now, having said that, as for me, I would have left it alone. It was workable. But you had some rabid anti-abortion types down in the South brought this lawsuit. And what they did is they unsettled the hornet's nest. Unsettling the hornet's nest, and they've created a political issue for the Democrats to run on when they have no other issue. And so what they're trying to do is they're trying to get the suburban white women to be outraged about that. Well, let me suggest to you, suburban white women, it's an important issue. I myself support the principles of Roe versus Wade. Every state can make its own decision on the state law and state constitution. Plenty abortion by demand. But if you think that it's succumbing to the tyranny of Islamic fundamentalism is going to protect you, you got to be kidding. If you believe when you have gays and lesbians for Hamas, was the biggest joke in the world, because they will have their heads chopped off and they'll be thrown off the tops of buildings. There is no tolerance for any kind of deviancy. These people kill their own. They've been fighting for hundreds of years. Shia versus Sunni, another sects of Islam. So what are we talking about? We're talking about people who have no tolerance for difference, no tolerance for another point of view, no tolerance for freedom of speech, no tolerance for freedom of expression or freedom of religion. That's what they're talking about. Get your head straight. This is a fight for the survival of America as a free country, domestically and from foreign enemies. Forget about parochial push-button issues. Think about the survival and the flourishing of this country. This is Let the Record Show with noted opinion commentator and reporter James Flippin of WABC. I'm Judge Richard Weinberg. We'll be back in a few moments. The final segment of this week's Let the Record Show. Stay tuned.
This is Let the Record Show.
Shopping is hard, right? But I found a better way. Stitch Fix online personal styling makes it easy. I just give my stylist my size, style, and budget preferences. I order boxes when I want and how I want. No subscription required. And he sends just for me pieces, plus outfit recommendations and styling tips. I keep what works and send back the rest. It's so easy. Make style easy. Get started today at StitchFix.com/Spotify. That's StitchFix.com/Spotify.
Halliday presents, in the red corner, the undisputed, undefeated Weed Whacker Guy. Champion of hurling grass and pollen everywhere. And in the blue corner, the challenger, extra strength Halliday. Eye drops that work all day to prevent the release of histamines that cause itchy allergy eyes. And the winner by knockout is Halliday. Halliday, bring it on.
Morning decisions. A creamy mocha frappuccino drink? A sweet vanilla? Maybe a smooth caramel or that white chocolate mocha. Whichever you choose, delicious coffee awaits. Start your day with bottled Starbucks Frappuccino drinks. Pick up a bottle near you wherever you buy your groceries.
Build professional skills this semester with Adobe Creative Cloud. and create standout work both in and out of the classroom. Save big on professional creativity tools. Students get 65% off Adobe Creative Cloud, including Photoshop, Illustrator, Premiere Pro, Acrobat Pro, and 20+ creative apps. No matter what project you're working on, Adobe Creative Cloud apps can help you take it to the next level. Visit adobe.com/student to learn more.
This is Let the Record Show. Now, here are your hosts, Judge Richard Weinberg and Suffolk County Republican Committee Chairman Jesse Garcia.
We're back on Let the Record Show with noted ABC reporter and opinion commentator James Flippin. James, I'll tell you what's troubling me. And then I want to switch gears to more international stuff. Two things trouble me, and I want to get your thoughts on those two, and then we'll do some international conversation. Kamala Harris wants to lead this country, yet she refuses to do interviews. She refuses to have press conferences. She's playing games with the debate, said, well, I'll do one, but I'm not sure about the other two. We don't know what the woman stands for. Now, I've said to friends, if I were running a campaign for Trump, I could easily sit down with you, James. In a half hour, I could write the reasons positively to vote for Trump and his record of accomplishment as president. And I could then write on the other side of the ledger the 5 or 6 things that Kamala Harris and Joe Biden did wrong to hurt this country. To me, it's an easy campaign. One of my problems is she's a no-show. She's hiding behind the teleprompter. It's analogous to what Biden did hiding in the basement. He had the cover of COVID. She doesn't have that cover. She should be interviewed, and she should be interviewed by serious people who ask serious questions, not by sweetheart deals where they give the questions in advance and so they can have prepackaged answers, where they're sitting there just saying, oh, how wonderful you are, Kamala. You're the new thing, you're the best new thing. Look at the shiny light. Everything's swell. It's ridiculous. Do your job. Tell the American people what you stand for. If you have a position on the border, don't change it. Say why you were there. Talk about the problem of the border. Talk about the problem of inflation. Talk about the problem of national security. Talk about the energy crisis. Stop this obsession with the Green New Deal and climate obsession. Our enemies are taking advantage of us. China is arming all of Hezbollah, all of Iran, all of the Houthis, all of Hamas. They're doing that. And where are they getting the money from that? They're getting it because China's buying their oil. So let's get real. And Iran is also supplying Russia in Russia's war against the Ukraine. So Kamala, get out there and tell people where you stand on those issues. Your thoughts?
Judge, I think you hit the nail on the head by saying that the Biden basement strategy is what really changed all of this, right? In other words, there's some willful diminishment of their own importance, some debasement of their mission, so to speak, from the media if they're not willing to advocate for their own importance, right? And yet I saw a headline in the Associated Press recently where they said the sit-down interview isn't what it used to be. And they were kind of providing cover for the fact that Kamala Harris has not done one of those sit-down interviews. She doesn't even really do press conferences, by and large. And then I thought about the same thing after that recent interview that Trump did with Elon Musk on X. The next day, you saw all these headlines from various news outlets, and we've seen them use this word a lot before, talking about Trump, that he was rambling, that it was a rambling interview. They said the same thing about the RNC speech that he gave. Now, look, you want to talk about political advice and consulting and all that kind of stuff? Maybe it would have been better if Trump had kept that speech shorter. I think a shorter speech is always a better speech.
Agreed.
But that said, he wasn't rambling. He was speaking more off the cuff, from the heart, not necessarily reading a teleprompter. The way the media is kind of treating these politicians these days, they like the person who's really packaged, who fits on a postage stamp, who fits on a card somewhere that they can put in a box.
Everything they say is an elevator speech.
Exactly. And that's the way they look at it. Now, look, in the day and age that we're talking about, we were joking about it in the break, right? People my generation glued to their phones. Everybody wants things in a 30-second soundbite, all that kind of thing. But again, the Biden basement strategy, the fact that it didn't matter that he wasn't out there campaigning, the fact that it didn't matter that he hasn't been accessible to the media. Frankly, President Biden has barely been accessible to the media. It goes to show you that what you're looking for, the traditional gumshoe reporter, the traditional journalistic ethic that's going to push and push and push and question that lack of access and question that lack of candor from a candidate, I don't know that it exists. I mean, you said he should sit down, or she should rather, Kamala Harris, for a tough interview. But where would that be? What outlet, what entity would conduct that tough interview?
Well, that's interesting you say that. It's an excellent point. Our mutual friend, the legendary and learned Michael Goodwin of the New York Post, a Pulitzer Prize-winning commentator and reporter, invited her to sit down with him. He said, it'll be a fair interview. It will be objective. I'm not going to give you sweetheart questions, and I'm not going to try to embarrass you. I just want to talk to you about the major issues of our time, and it will be fair. And people will listen to it because they know that I will be fair to you. If you sit down with MSNBC or one of these 11:30 at night talk show hosts that are totally in the camp of the left-wing Democratic machine, what's going to happen? They'll give you softball questions. I'll ask you the tough questions in the sense that the future of America is at stake, and where do you stand on these issues? So good for Michael Goodwin to inviting to this. I'm not particularly sanguine that Michael's going to get a good result from his request, but it would be in her interest to show she's a serious person. She has yet to demonstrate to me that she's a serious person.
And that's fair. I mean, I think that the other aspect of this that makes things especially challenging from like a media landscape, and also just if you're a regular person, an American voter, it's all hard to put your finger on. In other words, is Kamala Harris really the person that's running for president? Who was it that ran the Biden White House? We know that President Biden is diminished in his mental and physical faculties, still serving as president, as far as we know. There's a lot of speculation as to whether or not there's some sort of shadow Obama representation in the White House.
There's no doubt. Listen, you have enormous influence by the Obama people in that White House. For a while, you had influence of the wife,
Michelle.
No,
you're talking about Dr. Jill.
Dr. Jill. Now, listen, I'm respectful of people who are doctors.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And I think some very smart people are PhDs. And I guess there's some very smart people who have doctorates in education. But how that lends to leading the free world in a time of crisis and a great nation, which is a cradle of Western civilization, you got me.
I agree with you. I mean, look, I think that some of what we're talking about right now at length highlights a lot of the difficulty in what's going on the Republican side. I was talking with some of the guys here at the station before, and some people are routinely saying, and I think you probably kind of feel a lot the same way, that the Trump campaign should be focusing more on core issues.
Absolutely.
Border security,
absolutely,
economics, all this stuff. And I probably agree with you. However, the difficulty here is the fact that so much of this is shadow boxing and completely unprecedented in terms of what's going on. I mean, think about it. Weeks ago, at the RNC, which is always kind of the traditional put the bow on the whole campaign season for both sides, Biden was still a candidate. And now, again, without any press conference, without any real access, without any true scrutiny, nothing but platitudes about joy from basically 80 to 90% of the media, things go on. We continue. We're still running a campaign here. We're still ramping up to an election. So when you talk about the need for Republicans to be kind of mission-centered and talking about issues and all this kind of thing, everything right now is just hard to put your hands on. It's very unprecedented. I know it sounds like I'm making excuses. I just think that so much is playing out in real time. I largely probably agree with people who say there needs to be more focus on the issues. People vote with their pocketbook, all that kind of stuff. True. But there's so much craziness that continues to go on, and it's happening all the time. I mean, tomorrow, when we're recording this, there's going to be a joint appearance between Biden and Harris. That's the first time they've done it since she's announced her candidacy. And yet he's continuing to serve as president. She's continuing to serve as vice president while she's trying to distance herself from all the White House's policies. It's crazy.
It's remarkable. Let's switch gears. The crime explosion in America. They're trying to tell you that everything's fine. There's no lawlessness crisis. Well, you have illegal migrants coming from the cartels and from the gangs running the streets of New York and all across the country. They were flown in illegally, the cover of night by the Biden-Harris administration. They're all over this country. Every town, every city, every village today is a border town, James. All of them. There is no safe spaces anymore. We don't know who they are, whether they're terrorists, whether they're cartel members, you have people that just nabbed at the border, Palestinians. Who are they? Are they people who are seeking freedom and protection against the Hamas tyranny, or are they people who are doing us harm? We don't know. They've picked up noted terrorists. How many noted terrorists on watch lists got through that we don't know about? They violated the immigration laws of the United States. They violated the constitutional obligations to protect and defend this country. Where's Harris on this? The border czar. Now she's not the border czar. In the most Orwellian sense, with the great Orwellian eraser, she's no longer the border czar. Axios called her the border czar. Now Axios is repudiating their own reporting. So they're gaslighting the American people. The crime explosion is real. No less a light than Heather McDonald, one of the leading lights on public safety, law enforcement, and crime in America, from the Manhattan Institute, frequent commentator on television. Heather has pointed out that crime is exploding. Violent crime is up. Respect for the law is down. Criminals are being released without being held accountable. This is a serious problem, and the numbers are escalating all across the country. Whether you talk about the places proximate to the Mexican border, whether you're talking about people coming into Florida, whether you're talking about the resurgence of gangs on Long Island, all across the country, New Mexico, Nevada, Arizona, California, New York. This is a crisis. It's a crime explosion. It has to be dealt with. And how do we do that, James?
Well, in terms of the need to change policy surrounding what you're talking about, obviously the border needs to completely change. You know, we can't have this whole nebulous asylum seeker as a way to sort of cheat the system and be an illegal immigrant and expect that that's okay. Furthermore, once you actually get into the individual states and some of the problems that we see, I don't have to tell you that the way the standard has changed going in a more progressive direction in terms of bail reform, eliminating cash bail, kind of putting various mandates on what prosecutors and judges are supposed to do in terms of evaluating violent crime, all that stuff has made society worse off. You know what I mean? Like, the more that you want to talk about the sad story about a 16-year-old that gets locked up at Rikers Island for 2-3 years because he can't afford to pay the bail, terrible, right? An individual outlier that is a heartbreaking story. But when you think about the actual practical application of things like discovery and sharing people's addresses and addresses of witnesses, and you can't keep people behind bars even though they're accused of maiming and physically hurting other people and killing people and all that kind of stuff. That is a downfall of society type thing.
How about taking kids who are 16 years old, who've done the most heinous, violent rapes, assaults, slashings, and putting them in family court because you can't prosecute them as adults.
Right.
They have to be 18 years of age.
Right.
The so-called raise the age law. Well, what you've done is you've told the cartels, the guys who should do your enforcement, the guys who should be carrying the guns, the guys who should be doing the intimidation, are the 15, 16, 17-year-old
bingo
so-called kids.
Right.
You've enabled them to create an army of young people who terrorize the communities.
And it's the best laid plans of mice and men, right? In the way that government influences things where they really ought not to, and the things that happen. You can talk about it with the housing market and rent control and all this kind of stuff and what it's supposed to do and what it actually does and all that. But I was thinking about the border and thinking that that's really the most winning message for the Trump campaign. You want to talk about and share ideas about consulting and what you're talking about with the candidate. Kamala Harris served the role of border czar. The reason that happened was because everything that was happening with Biden during his tenure was bad, right? With the border, it was unchecked. It was outrageous. There was tens and thousands of people coming into various cities.
As we sit here today in the studio at WABC.
Right.
It's happening
It's
now.
still continuing.
Of course.
But they wanted it to happen for various reasons. Potentially, you're talking 20, 30, 40 years down the line, and maybe not even that long, in terms of growing the Democratic voter rolls. That said, there's a political price to pay for that.
There's
so they made the scapegoat.
There's a social price to pay.
There's also a social price to pay for sure. But the political price, that was supposed to fall on Kamala Harris. That's why they made her the border czar. It was a scapegoat type thing.
I agree.
Now, unfortunately for them, you turn around twice.
The scapegoat became the candidate.
She became the candidate. So now you need to hammer this idea of the border is broken, that Trump is the guy to fix the border, that the executive's role is to enforce laws, that it's not a question of compassion and social causes and economics in South America and cartel activity and all that kind of stuff. Put that aside. What's the basic law? The basic law is that there are parameters when it comes to immigration, and there's a process by which that has to happen. You talk about the economy, people vote with their wallet. I agree with all that, but inflation's kind of a complicated concept. It's hard to understand for some people how much government spending, for example, impacts that.
Oh, by the way,
the border's a lot more basic.
Well, but let's talk about that. You said something very interesting. Inflation, government spending. Who's the one who broke the deadlock on all these spend bills, these sweetheart deals in these funding mechanisms that were funding all these Green New Deal craziness about getting rid of fossil fuels? If you don't have fossil fuels, you don't have energy. Wake up. There's no infrastructure in place that allow you to electrify everything. So people are going to freeze to death in the winter, and they're going to have heat stroke in the summer, and cars are not going to be able to be moving, and buses will stop because the grid is not sustainable.
Mm-hmm.
The electric system, you want to do that, plug it out 30 years from now, 40 years from now, and do it gradually as a hybrid approach. You just don't get rid of fossil fuel. And she's dedicated to getting fossil fuel. Let's talk about this. I want to talk about a very interesting column. It's 3 minutes. My God, this show's gone very quickly. I want your thoughts. The noted commentator, Gordon Chang, had a very interesting piece, and I want to get your thoughts. He said in Gatestone, he said, Iran wants a war in the Middle East because it wants destabilization to break up the Western alliance. He said something very interesting. Hamas, Houthis, Hezbollah, Islamic Jihad, they're all proxies for Iran. But in Gordon Chang, the noted commentator on Chinese affairs, has said, Iran is itself a surrogate for China. It's a proxy for China. It's one of their vessels to create international destabilization. And by doing that, it then gathers the ability to steamroll more economic, political, social, military dominance by the Chinese. Final thoughts on that topic?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good point. I think that traditionally you have this understanding, and that may not be 100% true as China increases its military capabilities and so on and so forth, that in terms of hard power, the U.S. military matches up very, very well with almost any opponent that you could imagine on the so-called battlefield. But the soft power aspect of things and the need to break up alliances and diminish influence and diminish legitimacy, all that kind of stuff. When October 7th happened, immediately you wondered, well, what's the end game here? Hamas has to know that Israel's going to come back really hard. As you said, the proxies, the people behind the curtain, people adjusting knobs and making influence and all that kind of stuff, are looking for a fraying of the alliance between whatever Western influence there is in the Middle East and obviously the United States at home, all of that. The more that you can destabilize that, the better off it is for the people that want to be that next entity to fill the vacuum. Obviously, China potentially naming that.
Well, people say we can reach some sort of accommodation with China. But my answer to that is not when they're flying spy balloons over our country unchecked. Not when they're flying planes with Russia near the Alaskan border with Russia. Not when China's doing war games off the coast of Taiwan. Not when China and Iran are violating the Monroe Doctrine, unfettered, unchecked, unchallenged by the Biden-Harris administration all over Latin America.
And the last thing I'll say, Judge, is let's remember who is the president that didn't get us into wars, that wasn't having all this chaos happen during his tenure? Former President Trump.
And you know why that is? In the immortal words of Machiavelli, who wrote The Prince, it is better to be feared than loved. The regretful thing about the Biden-Harris administration over these 3.5+ years is we are neither loved nor feared. We are weakened, we're a laughingstock, and we cannot afford another 4 years of this kind of dereliction of duty and obligation to this country. James Fiplin, my esteemed colleague, great reporter, great commentator, opinion commentator for WABC and WLIR. What a joy it's been to share this hour with you. Please come back more often.
That'd be great, Judge. I would love that.
You're absolutely the best, and I thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
This has been the Let the Record Show. God bless you, and God bless America.
This is Let the Record Show.